Welcome to video 3 on markets. In this particular video on markets, we will move to the supply side of the market story. So we're going to cover the following two. The following two learning objectives: how to construct a supply curve and how to distinguish between what we call a shift in supply or a change in supply versus a change in quantity supplied. And so the parallel to the story of the demand curve will now be happening on the supply side of things. What is a supply curve? A supply curve is a relationship that allows you to describe how the price of a good and the quantity supplied of the good relate to one another, all else being the same. And according to the law of supply, what we should see on the supply side of things is that as the price that the market yields for supplying a good increases, the quantity supplied of the goods should also increase. That there should be a positive or direct relationship in the marketplace between the price of a regular good and the quantity supplied of a regular private good. So the supply curve should look like an upward sloping line in the two-dimensional description of the price of a good and the quantity of a good, such as in this cell phones example here. Now, what might cause a change in the supply of the good? Well, we have the 5 more important non-price determinants of supply that could cause that. A technological improvement should result in a rightward shift of the supply curve, and a technological drawback should result in a fallback on the supply of a commodity. So can technological innovations for competing goods can result in lower supply of the good in question. So we capture those types of changes in the price of related goods. When we have substitutes for goods, if the price of a substitute goes down, then the supply of the good in question should shift to the left, should also go down. Whereas if the price of a complement goes down, that makes the purchase of the good in question be a better or easier to create, and that should create a supply shift also to in the right direction, in the improving supply conditions direction. The number of firms in the industry matters. The more firms there are, the bigger the supply, the more to the right you should see a shift. And with respect to prices of inputs, inputs in a production process are, for example, the use of capital, which could be machinery, use of inputs such as raw materials or prefabricated parts or components to a final product. It could also be labor, or it could be energy costs. And as those inputs become less expensive, then the supply should actually increase. So there's a negative or inverse relationship between the price of inputs and the supply. Cheaper inputs, more supply. More expensive inputs, less supply. And expectations may also play a role in supplying goods and services. For example, going back to the earlier video's example of what happens in a pandemic to supply. And you might have seen some stories in the news of what's called price gouging. And in some situations, smaller local stores, grocery stores, liquor stores, in some cases were charging extraordinary prices for things that were already on their inventory that they had paid much less than the and than the expectations of the pandemic environment created. So, for example, if a 7-Eleven bought a lot of the usual amount of yogurt that they sell in a week, but they were concerned that their yogurt shipments would be somehow interrupted by the shelter-in-place order at the state level, they might be very cautious with putting out their yogurt supply in a normal way. They might lower the number of units that they put out in stock, and they might charge a higher price per unit and thus capture a greater profit, even though nothing has really changed per se in the production of yogurt, or for that matter, in the logistics of transporting the yogurt to the local 7-Elevens for sale. But just the expectation that something catastrophic may be happening may lead producers to change prices very suddenly and change supplies very suddenly. All those changes would register as shifts in the supply curve. The other thing that may happen is the actual price of the good may be changing due to market conditions. And in that case, as you can see in the right graph, in the rightward graph, if the prices of goods goes up, the quantity supplied by the existing number of firms will also rise. But that's because the quantity supplied will rise, not because the supply increases. So own prices show as movements along, as causing movements along a single supply curve. Thus, we call those quantity supplied changing. And when any other factor than own price is impacting supply, and a list of those factors is technology, number of firms producing, the inputs in the production process, related goods, substitutes, complements, and the expectations and risk factors about uncertainties into the future, those will create shifts to the left when we see a decline in supply, and to the right when we see an increase in supply. Okay. So for example, let's look at this spreadsheet that says active learning, supply shifts versus movements along the supply curve. What happens if a new Chinese cell phone manufacturer enters the market? That should be a rightward shift in supply because you have more firms selling cell phones to, all else being the same consumers in that market. Second, producers expect cell phone prices to rise. So if producers expect cell phone prices to rise, you might see an increase in the quantity supplied by the existing firms in the industry. So that would be a movement along the supply curve. What if producers cut price for a Black Friday sale? If producers cut price for a sale, what they should expect is a need for supplies to be reduced. So usually they offer goods that are on sale for goods in inventories that are essentially going to be replaced by newer models or goods that are in non-abundant availability within the inventories of companies. So I hope that you have gotten a good idea as to what a market is, how a market functions, what the demand is in a market environment, and what supply is in a market environment. In the coming videos, we will place both supply and demand and the same structure of price versus quantity, and we will look at how markets achieve what we call equilibrium and signal value in price. In the meantime, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy the coming videos in this series of videos on Chapter 3, the market. Take care.